Imagine a world beneath the surface of the history we think we know. A world where shadows of forgotten cults and secret knowledge stretch across continents and centuries, silently shaping the destinies of nations and the bloodlines of rulers. It is a story that begins not in the grand halls of Europe, but in the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt, where the Nile's waters have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations and the whispers of mysteries that the world may never fully comprehend. The history textbooks offer dates, pharaohs, and monumental achievements, but between these lines lie the untold stories, the quiet, deliberate preservation of knowledge reserved for the initiated, the chosen, and the hidden. In the heart of ancient Egypt, alongside towering pyramids and massive temples, there existed a labyrinth of secret chambers, hidden shrines, and mystical libraries. These were the domains of the priests, the adepts, and the guardians of knowledge too powerful to be revealed to the uninitiated. While the world marveled at the grandeur of the pharaohs' tombs and the artistry of hieroglyphs, few understood that much of Egypt's most potent wisdom was deliberately concealed. It was a wisdom that spoke not only of life and death, but of the very threads connecting humanity, spirit, and power. Knowledge that, some scholars argue, traveled far beyond the sands of the Nile. From these hidden enclaves emerged cults that worshipped not just gods, but the very essence of cosmic order and secret laws of the universe. They were the custodians of initiation rites, mystical formulas, and sacred practices that promised enlightenment, longevity, and sometimes control over the unseen forces of life itself. To the average citizen, these cults were invisible, like shadows behind the veil of normal existence. To those chosen to enter, they were gateways to truths too dangerous or profound for the masses. It is within this secretive world that the seeds of what would become Europe's hidden bloodlines were sown. For centuries, Egypt was a hub of trade, conquest, and migration, linking civilizations across the Mediterranean. Traders, scholars, and exiled priests traveled across the seas, carrying with them knowledge encoded in symbols, rituals, and esoteric practices. Some claim that these emissaries of the hidden orders established roots in Europe, influencing royal houses, shaping philosophies, and preserving wisdom that official histories would later erase or ignore. The suggestion is chilling in its audacity, that beneath the familiar tapestry of European history lies a hidden lineage, a shadow network tracing back to the Nile, to cults and priesthoods that once commanded secrets humanity still struggles to understand. But why has this knowledge remained hidden? The answer, it seems, is as old as the cults themselves: power. Knowledge, in its most potent form, has always been dangerous. It can elevate or destroy, liberate or control. Throughout history, those who understood these truths often guarded them jealously, passing them only to trusted heirs, carefully concealing them from eyes deemed unworthy. And so, a pattern emerged, a hidden thread weaving through generations, linking pharaohs to European kings, mystics to philosophers, secret orders to public institutions. The mainstream narrative, with its linear timelines and sanitized histories, often misses these threads entirely, leaving only faint echoes for those willing to listen closely. This documentary seeks to follow those whispers, to trace the path of hidden cults and ancient bloodlines from the deserts of Egypt to the grand halls of Europe. It will explore the rituals, the symbols, the secret societies, and the enigmatic figures who may have carried this knowledge across centuries. Along the way, we will encounter mysteries that defy explanation, artifacts that challenge conventional history, and stories suppressed or forgotten by time. Every shadow conceals a possibility, every symbol hints at a greater truth, and every story has a thread connecting it to a hidden lineage whose influence might still resonate in the present. As we begin this journey, it is important to suspend what you believe you know about history. What you are about to hear is not found in textbooks, not celebrated in museums, and often dismissed as speculation by mainstream scholars. And yet, when we examine the evidence, the patterns and the subtle consistencies across time and space, a picture begins to emerge, one of profound complexity, deep secrecy, and an enduring human fascination with knowledge that is just beyond reach. So, let us step quietly into the shadows of history, into the whispers of ancient cults, and into the hidden currents that may have shaped the world in ways few dare to imagine. From the sunlit Nile to the shadowed corridors of European power, the story begins here, in the world between the known and the concealed. What follows is a journey not just through history, but through the secret architecture of power, belief, and bloodlines that may connect Egypt to Europe in ways that remain hidden even today. Ancient Egypt is often imagined as a land of golden sands, monumental pyramids, and iconic gods whose names are whispered across the ages. The pharaohs, adorned in resplendent crowns and lavish robes, appear in our history books as the ultimate rulers, divinely appointed and publicly glorified. But beneath the splendor and the stone facades of temples lies a far more intricate and secretive world, one rarely glimpsed by the casual observer or even by mainstream historians. This is the Egypt of shadows, a realm where power was not only political but deeply spiritual, and where knowledge was carefully partitioned, concealed from those deemed unworthy. While we marvel at the massive stone monuments and the precision of the pyramids, it is essential to remember that these visible achievements were often only the public face of an otherwise hidden society. Beneath the surface, the priests and initiates managed rituals, interpreted cosmic laws, and maintained archives of wisdom that spoke of creation, the afterlife, and the hidden architecture of the universe itself. Some of these texts were etched into stone, while others were written on papyrus and stored in chambers sealed for centuries, accessible only to those who had undergone rigorous initiation. It was a hierarchy not just of power, but of secrecy, a world in which the line between knowledge and danger was razor thin. Among these shadowed institutions were secret chambers and subterranean sanctuaries within temples, accessible only to the elite of the priesthood. In these hidden spaces, the rituals of initiation were carried out in total secrecy. Some scholars suggest that these ceremonies were not merely symbolic, but that they conveyed techniques of meditation, energy manipulation, or esoteric practices designed to unlock aspects of human potential. The world outside may have seen the priests as mere intermediaries of the gods, but within these sanctuaries, the very fabric of reality and the structure of hidden knowledge were carefully guarded. The contrast between public and private Egypt is striking. To the masses, the pharaoh was a living god, temples were sacred centers of worship, and rituals were spectacles of devotion. But for those within the inner circles, there existed a different understanding, a coded language of symbols, rituals, and sacred geometry, designed to transmit knowledge without exposing it to outsiders. Obelisks, pyramids, and statues were not only monuments. They were markers, tools, and repositories of a much deeper esoteric system, accessible only to those who knew how to read them. It is within this duality, public grandeur versus hidden mastery, that the seeds of later European mysteries may have been planted. Many Egyptian cults and secret societies were adept at recording knowledge in symbolic and allegorical ways, ensuring that even if outsiders gained access to texts or artifacts, the deeper meanings would remain obscured. When these ideas eventually traveled beyond Egypt's borders, they carried with them a cryptic language of power and ritual that could be interpreted only by those who were initiated into the lineage of the mystery traditions. Some historians suggest that certain pharaohs themselves were not only political leaders, but custodians of this esoteric knowledge. They were trained in secret rites from childhood, taught to navigate the metaphysical as well as the temporal realms. Their authority, therefore, was both visible and invisible. Their decrees backed by political might, their wisdom encoded in hidden practices and sacred symbols. Even today, many of these rituals remain undeciphered, and artifacts found in tombs hint at a complexity that modern archaeology has only begun to scratch the surface of. Consider, for example, the famous temples of Karnak and Luxor. While these massive complexes are studied for their architectural brilliance and historical significance, few fully grasp the alignment of their chambers with celestial phenomena, the layering of hidden passages, or the symbolic interplay of statues, reliefs, and hieroglyphs. Every carving, every placement may have served dual purposes, publicly commemorative, privately instructive. Scholars have long debated the function of hidden chambers within these temples, suggesting that they may have been sites of advanced spiritual practice or repositories of knowledge intentionally concealed from the general populace. It is also in the burial practices of the pharaohs that we catch a glimpse of this hidden Egypt. Tombs like those in the Valley of the Kings were not merely final resting places. They were designed as metaphysical maps for the journey of the soul, filled with coded symbols and intricate inscriptions intended to guide the deceased through spiritual realms. Some researchers argue that these burial rituals contain hints of knowledge about life, death, and transcendence that were considered too sacred to share openly, preserved only for those who have been initiated into the mysteries. By examining these shadowed dimensions, one begins to see that ancient Egypt was not merely a civilization of monumental architecture and grand narratives. It was a society built upon layers of concealed knowledge. This knowledge was carefully guarded, passed down through select priestly lineages, and encoded in symbols that survive today in art, architecture, and perhaps even in the bloodlines of those who were meant to inherit it. The Egypt we think we know, the pharaohs, the pyramids, the gods, is only half the story. Beneath it lies a hidden network of wisdom, rituals, and mysteries that may have traveled far beyond the desert, influencing civilizations across Europe and shaping the course of history in ways we are only beginning to uncover. As we delve deeper into this hidden world, we will follow the trails of these secret cults, trace the journey of their knowledge beyond Egypt's borders, and explore how it may have woven itself into the very fabric of European history. The Egypt of Shadows is a world of secrecy, symbolism, and extraordinary power, waiting for those willing to look beyond the monuments and listen to the whispers of the past. In the shadows of Egypt's towering monuments and sunlit temples existed a world few dared to speak of openly, a world of secretive cults whose influence stretched far beyond the Nile. These were not mere religious sects in the way most imagine, performing ritualistic prayers for public approval. They were initiatory orders, keepers of sacred knowledge, and guardians of mysteries that touched the very fabric of existence. Among them, the solar mysteries, the oracles of Ammonius, and other enigmatic orders cultivated secrets that many believe would ripple through time, eventually reaching distant lands and shaping the foundations of Europe's hidden bloodlines. The solar mysteries, for instance, were centered on the worship of the sun, not merely as a celestial body, but as the source of divine energy, knowledge, and cosmic order. Initiates were trained to interpret the movements of celestial bodies, the cycles of light and shadow, and the subtle correspondences between heaven and earth. Their rituals were deeply symbolic, designed to align the practitioner with the rhythms of the universe. Some scholars suggest these practices contained proto-scientific knowledge, understanding of astronomy, timekeeping, and perhaps even mathematics far ahead of their era. But beyond the technical, there was a spiritual mastery at play, a philosophy of life, death, and rebirth encoded in ceremonial practices and secret texts. The oracles of Ammonius, another hidden faction, were considered even more secretive, often operating under layers of deception to mask their true power. Priests of Ammonius were said to possess the ability to foresee events, interpret omens, and offer guidance that shaped the decisions of pharaohs and nobles alike. Their temples were constructed with hidden chambers, labyrinthine corridors, and secret sanctums, accessible only to those who had completed rigorous initiation. Within these chambers, knowledge was not merely shared, it was experienced. Symbols, chants, and rituals worked together to transform the consciousness of the practitioner, connecting them to forces invisible to ordinary perception. These cults were not static. They evolved with time, often merging with other orders, adapting to political pressures, and surviving through secrecy. Their influence was subtle yet profound. While pharaohs ruled the land openly, these hidden orders shaped policies, guided decisions, and sometimes even orchestrated events behind the veil of officialdom. The secrecy was essential. Knowledge in their hands was power, and power in the hands of the uninitiated could be catastrophic. The cults operated in whispers, carefully selecting who might be trusted with fragments of their wisdom. Even within Egypt, access to this knowledge was a privilege, a dangerous gift reserved for a chosen few. What makes these cults particularly intriguing is their long-term vision. Unlike political entities concerned only with immediate control, the Egyptian secret orders were aware of the persistence of time and the transmission of knowledge across generations. Some historians propose that they intentionally prepared emissaries and protégés to carry their teachings far beyond Egypt's borders, planting seeds in distant lands and ensuring that the esoteric lineage would survive the fall of dynasties, invasions, and cultural shifts. It is in this framework that the connection to European bloodlines begins to emerge, suggesting a continuity of influence that defies conventional historical narratives. Symbols played a critical role in these cults, acting as both tools of initiation and protective codes. The sun disk, the serpent, the ankh, and countless other motifs were never mere decoration. They were carriers of hidden meaning, embedded with instructions, philosophical insights, and metaphysical principles. Initiates learned to read these symbols not with the eyes alone, but with a cultivated inner perception. Some accounts hint that these teachings could alter consciousness, enhance intuition, or even grant the adept an unusual awareness of events beyond their immediate environment. To the outside observer, these were mysterious or magical. To the initiate, they were tools of understanding the deeper laws of existence. Rituals within these cults were elaborate, often extending over days or even months. Initiates underwent physical, mental, and spiritual training designed to purify, test, and awaken latent faculties. Ceremonies incorporated music, chanting, and precise movements aligned with cosmic rhythms. Some rituals were held at dawn, harnessing the first rays of the sun, while others were conducted under the moon, tapping into the interplay of light and darkness. Every action, every symbol, every uttered word was layered with meaning, forming a complex language of initiation that only the trained could comprehend. It is this very secrecy that has allowed myths and legends about these cults to persist, while factual histories remain fragmentary. Travelers, chroniclers, and later European scholars reported whispers of Egyptian adepts with knowledge beyond ordinary comprehension, priests who could heal, foresee events, or manipulate outcomes. Over time, these stories evolved into tales of alchemy, secret orders, and mystical lineages. While skepticism remains, the persistence of these accounts across centuries suggests that the cult's influence may have been far-reaching and not entirely symbolic. By tracing the solar mysteries, the oracles of Ammonius, and other hidden cults, we begin to see a pattern, a deliberate, methodical effort to preserve knowledge, power, and spiritual mastery beyond the lifespan of any single dynasty. These cults were architects of a hidden history, constructing frameworks of wisdom meant to survive upheaval, conquest, and the erosion of memory. And as we will explore, some of these frameworks may have found new life in Europe, carried through bloodlines, secret societies, and esoteric traditions that flourished centuries later. The story of the hidden Egyptian cults is thus not one of mere superstition or lost ritual. It is a story of strategic preservation, of knowledge encoded in symbols, transmitted in secrecy, and carried across continents. It challenges our understanding of history, blurring the lines between myth and reality, and setting the stage for a deeper exploration of how these ancient practices might have influenced Europe's hidden elites, secret orders, and the very fabric of power itself. As the sun sets over the sands of Egypt, one might imagine that the mysteries of the Nile were destined to remain within its borders, hidden beneath stone temples and encrypted in hieroglyphs. Yet, history and legend suggest otherwise. The knowledge of the hidden cults, their rituals, and their esoteric wisdom did not vanish with the fall of dynasties. Instead, it began a subtle migration, moving with traders, scholars, exiles, and wandering adepts across deserts, seas, and mountains. These emissaries carried with them not only goods but ideas, sacred symbols, and the promise of hidden knowledge, sowing seeds that would eventually take root far from the sun-baked lands of Egypt. Trade routes were the arteries through which much of this knowledge traveled. The Mediterranean, in particular, became a conduit for culture, religion, and philosophy. Ports such as Alexandria and Byblos were bustling centers of exchange, not only of grain, spices, and precious metals, but of manuscripts, symbolic objects, and esoteric teachings. Egyptian priests sometimes traveled under the guise of scholars or merchants, bringing fragments of sacred wisdom to distant lands. Some accounts suggest that these travelers engaged with Greek philosophers, influencing early European thought, while others moved quietly, establishing secret enclaves where knowledge could survive without interference from hostile rulers. Caravan routes across the Sinai and into the Levant also served as hidden pathways for the migration of secrets. These were treacherous journeys, crossing deserts where few dared to venture. Yet, it is here that the seeds of continuity were carefully sown. Priests and initiates would carry sacred scrolls wrapped in protective coverings, symbols etched into portable tablets, and oral teachings memorized for transmission. Their mission was clear. Knowledge must survive, even if the civilizations that nurtured it were under threat. Every journey was a deliberate act of preservation, a conscious effort to extend the life of wisdom beyond the temporal confines of Egypt. The migration of Egyptian knowledge into Europe is subtle, almost invisible, yet marked by intriguing hints. Classical authors occasionally mentioned Egyptian adepts or wise men from the Nile visiting distant lands. These references are sparse, often dismissed as anecdotal, but when pieced together, they suggest a network of contact that connected Egypt with emerging European civilizations. It was not a mass movement. It was selective, controlled, and highly secretive. The aim was not to dominate or convert, but to plant the foundations of knowledge in locations where it could survive political upheaval, persecution, and the erosion of memory. Some historians argue that exiled priests were particularly instrumental in this process. When dynasties fell or political unrest threatened the continuity of cultic knowledge, certain priests left Egypt voluntarily or were forced into exile, carrying with them the essence of their teachings. They sought patronage among foreign rulers, often presenting themselves as astrologers, healers, or scholars. In these roles, they gained access to courts and elite circles, subtly influencing political and cultural development. Through them, hidden Egyptian wisdom began to merge with local traditions, leaving an indelible, if often invisible, mark on European society. It is in these interactions that we see the earliest seeds of the bloodline connections later associated with European elites. Knowledge was not merely intellectual. It was genealogical and initiatory. Certain families were entrusted with teachings, sworn to secrecy, and bound by oaths that linked them spiritually and symbolically to the Egyptian cults. Symbols, rituals, and initiatory practices were passed down, often disguised as philosophy, alchemy, or noble tradition. Over centuries, these teachings became interwoven with the fabric of European aristocracy, forming hidden lineages that some researchers argue can be traced back to the priests of Egypt. Mediterranean trade, the movement of scholars, and the exodus of priests created an intricate web of cultural exchange. Temples and sacred sites in Europe, particularly in regions like Greece, Italy, and southern France, sometimes display symbols that echo Egyptian motifs: sun discs, serpents, and geometric forms. Whether these appearances are coincidental, inspirational, or evidence of direct transmission is a matter of debate, yet the consistency and recurrence of these symbols suggest a continuity worth investigating. In some cases, European architecture, ritual, and secret societies bear striking resemblance to what is known of Egyptian cultic practices, hinting at a lineage that survived through centuries of deliberate secrecy. The preservation of this knowledge required subtlety. European rulers and elites were often unaware of the depth and origin of what they adopted, perceiving it as mysticism, philosophy, or ritual art. Meanwhile, the true custodians, the descendants of Egyptian initiates, ensured that only fragments of knowledge were revealed, carefully controlling the flow of information. Symbols, gestures, and coded text became tools of transmission, allowing initiates to recognize each other and continue the lineage without exposing secrets to the masses. In this way, the migration of Egyptian wisdom was less about conquest and more about careful, patient cultivation over generations. By the time these traditions became embedded in European soil, centuries had passed, yet the influence of Egyptian cults remained palpable. Hidden knowledge had survived in manuscripts, rituals, and families entrusted with esoteric teachings. The migration of secrets was not an abrupt event, but a deliberate process, carried out over centuries, ensuring continuity even in the face of dynastic collapse, foreign invasion, and cultural transformation. It is this long thread of preservation that connects the hidden cults of Egypt with the enigmatic bloodlines and secret societies of Europe, an invisible bridge linking continents, eras, and mysteries. As we trace these movements further, the question emerges: how much of European history, philosophy, and culture is infused with echoes of this hidden Egyptian legacy? Were medieval and Renaissance elites merely inspired by Egyptian ideas, or did they inherit a far deeper, more secret lineage of knowledge and power? To answer this, we must follow the trail of symbols, texts, and bloodlines, unraveling the subtle ways in which Egyptian wisdom traveled across deserts and seas, ultimately shaping the hidden currents of European civilization. As Egyptian knowledge slowly migrated across deserts and seas, its influence began to take root in Europe, not openly, but in ways that would leave a subtle and enduring imprint. Ancient texts, sacred symbols, and ritual practices, once the exclusive domain of pharaohs and priests, began to intertwine with the emerging political and spiritual structures of European civilization. Some historians argue that European royal families and noble bloodlines were not merely inspired by this wisdom. They may have inherited it directly, becoming living vessels for traditions that originated along the Nile. The idea is provocative, that the kings, queens, and aristocrats we read about in history books may have been more than political figures. They may have been custodians of an ancient and secret lineage of knowledge. The connection is often hidden in plain sight, embedded within heraldic symbols, architectural design, and ceremonial traditions. Crowns, scepters, and coats of arms frequently feature motifs reminiscent of Egyptian iconography: the sun disk, serpents, pyramidal shapes, and the lotus. While mainstream historians typically interpret these as aesthetic choices or borrowings from classical art, a deeper, More conspiratorial reading suggests a deliberate preservation of sacred symbols. These emblems may have served as identifiers within a secret network, signaling the wearer's connection to the esoteric lineages descending from Egyptian initiates. Many European courts maintained elaborate rituals of coronation, ceremony, and religious observance, some of which bear uncanny resemblance to initiation rites described in ancient Egyptian sources. The parallels extend beyond the ceremonial. The very notion of divine right, a king sanctioned by God to rule, echoes the Egyptian concept of the pharaoh as both mortal and divine, a bridge between heaven and earth. Could these practices have been more than coincidence? Were the rituals and ceremonies consciously designed to replicate, preserve, or honor hidden knowledge transmitted from Egyptian priesthoods? The evidence is tantalizing, even if frustratingly fragmentary. Certain families, in particular, are often cited as custodians of this hidden lineage. Bloodline research, genealogical studies, and historical rumor converge to suggest that some European nobles were carefully selected to inherit not only wealth and power, but also esoteric wisdom. These families maintained secrecy across generations, safeguarding symbols, texts, and practices that linked them, perhaps unknowingly, to ancient Egyptian cults. The pattern is subtle yet persistent. Names, emblems, and ceremonial practices repeatedly suggest a continuity that spans continents and millennia, hinting at a deliberate, hidden architecture underlying Europe's visible history. The influence extended beyond nobility into the inner circles of power. Advisors, courtiers, and trusted scholars often acted as intermediaries between hidden knowledge and political authority. They might have been initiated into esoteric traditions, learning to interpret symbols, predict political shifts, or manage power in ways invisible to outsiders. Some European rulers, knowingly or unknowingly, may have relied on these advisors to preserve and utilize wisdom that originated in Egypt. In this framework, the apparent power of the monarchy was only part of the story. Beneath the surface, a network of hidden patrons and secret guardians shaped decisions and influenced history. Architecture provides another window into this hidden world. Palaces, cathedrals, and temples across Europe frequently incorporate numerology, geometric alignments, and symbolic motifs that echo Egyptian principles of sacred design. The golden ratio, solar alignments, and labyrinthine corridors are more than aesthetic flourishes. They may reflect knowledge transmitted across generations, deliberately encoded to ensure survival and continuity. Initiates familiar with these symbols would recognize their significance, while the uninitiated would see only artistry. In this way, European royalty and their patrons became living stewards of knowledge, preserving a coded language that linked them to the distant mysteries of the Nile. The selective dissemination of knowledge ensured that power remained concentrated. Just as Egyptian priests protected their teachings from the masses, European elites controlled access to esoteric wisdom. Manuscripts were copied and preserved in private libraries. Symbols were woven into family crests, and rituals were practiced behind closed doors. This careful stewardship allowed the wisdom to survive not only through conquest and political upheaval, but also through centuries of cultural transformation. Even when dynasties fell or kingdoms were invaded, the hidden networks endured, protected by secrecy, loyalty, and bloodline. It is impossible to ignore the role of religion in this continuity. Christianity, which came to dominate Europe, often absorbed or reinterpreted earlier pagan practices. In some cases, what appeared to be Christian ritual may have been a veneer over older, Egyptian-inspired esoteric traditions. Secret orders within the church, particularly in the medieval period, could have functioned as guardians of knowledge, ensuring that select teachings and symbols survived under the guise of religious orthodoxy. Some researchers even argue that certain mystical practices, alchemical texts, and ceremonial rites trace their origins directly to Egyptian initiates who had migrated to Europe centuries earlier. Ultimately, the story of European thrones and hidden patrons is one of convergence. Egyptian wisdom, carefully preserved and migrated across the Mediterranean, found fertile ground in the courts and noble families of Europe. Symbols, rituals, and teachings were embedded into the very fabric of governance, culture, and ceremony, linking rulers to a hidden lineage that transcended geography and time. The kings, queens, and nobles of Europe were not only political figures. They may have been living conduits of an ancient knowledge, entrusted with the responsibility to safeguard secrets that reach back to the heart of Egypt. As we continue this journey, we will delve deeper into the symbols and codices that encoded these teachings, exploring how the esoteric language of the ancients survived across centuries. By examining heraldry, manuscripts, and secret rituals, we begin to see the subtle fingerprints of Egyptian influence on European power. This hidden thread, woven into the tapestry of history, challenges the conventional narrative and invites us to question how much of the past is visible and how much remains intentionally concealed. Across the vast sweep of human history, certain symbols have persisted with remarkable consistency, appearing in civilizations separated by centuries and continents. In Egypt, these symbols were not mere decoration or artistic flourish. They were vessels of knowledge, encoding the teachings of secret cults and the wisdom of initiates. Obelisks reaching skyward, the serpent coiled in eternal vigilance, the ankh representing life beyond life, all carried layers of meaning accessible only to those trained to read them. As knowledge migrated to Europe, these symbols did not vanish. They evolved, reappeared in manuscripts, architecture, and rituals, and became a hidden language bridging the ancient and modern worlds. The codices and texts preserved by initiates were equally enigmatic. Scrolls written in hieroglyphs, pictographs, and later in cryptic scripts formed complex manuals of initiation, spiritual practice, and metaphysical theory. Many of these codices were never intended for casual reading. Instead, they were encoded with layers of meaning, allegory, metaphor, numerology, and symbolic correspondences designed to reveal themselves only to the prepared mind. To the untrained eye, these texts appeared opaque, mysterious, and often magical. To the initiate, they were blueprints of cosmic understanding, maps for navigating both the physical and spiritual realms. The importance of symbols in preserving knowledge cannot be overstated. Consider the serpent, which in Egypt represented wisdom, renewal, and the cyclical nature of life. In European heraldry, the serpent often reappears, subtly integrated into coats of arms, architectural motifs, and mystical diagrams. The ankh, representing eternal life, can be traced in subtle variations in medieval manuscripts and secret society iconography. These symbols were not accidental borrowings. They were intentional carriers of esoteric knowledge, signaling continuity across time and geography. Initiates recognized the patterns, allowing them to trace their lineage back to the original wisdom of the Nile. Even more intricate were the codices that combined symbols with philosophical and ritual instruction. Some texts contained elaborate allegories, blending mythology with metaphysics, while others employed numeric codes and geometric patterns that concealed deeper teachings. The use of sacred geometry, for example, was a hallmark of these codices. Shapes like the triangle, square, and circle were never purely decorative. They encoded principles of balance, proportion, and cosmic harmony. For initiates, understanding these forms was a form of initiation itself, revealing hidden structures that underlie both the natural and spiritual worlds. The transmission of these symbols and codices into Europe often occurred in subtle ways. Travelers, scholars, and exiled priests would present fragments of knowledge under the guise of philosophy, mathematics, or art. Monastic scribes copied texts that incorporated Egyptian motifs, sometimes unconsciously preserving the encoded teachings. Nobility adopted symbolic objects and rituals, unaware that their actions reflected an unbroken chain of esoteric tradition. Even when knowledge appeared fragmented or obscured, the recurrence of specific symbols suggests deliberate preservation, a methodical effort to maintain continuity despite the passage of centuries. Manuscripts like the Ripley Scroll, the Voynich manuscript, and other enigmatic texts often hint at this layered tradition. While mainstream scholars debate their origins and meaning, some researchers argue that these codices echo the language of the Egyptian initiates, encoded knowledge designed to be understood only by those who have been prepared through initiation. The combination of imagery, numeric sequences, and symbolic logic within these texts suggests a continuity of thought that spans continents, linking the rituals of Egyptian cults with the secret practices of European orders. Symbols also functioned as a means of communication between hidden societies. Just as Egyptian initiates used hieroglyphs, gestures, and ritualistic signs to convey meaning, European secret societies adopted their own coded language. Masonic symbols, alchemical diagrams, and mystical emblems often reflect principles first articulated in Egypt. These symbols acted as keys, allowing members to recognize one another, interpret teachings, and continue a lineage of knowledge otherwise concealed from the general public. The subtle integration of these signs into architecture, art, and ceremony ensured that knowledge survived under the radar of mainstream observation. The codices themselves were living instruments of initiation. Students were taught not merely to read, but to interpret, meditate on, and enact the principles contained within. Symbols were combined with ritual, movement, and oral teaching to produce a complete system of spiritual transformation. In this sense, the knowledge preserved in codices and symbols was not abstract. It was practical, experiential, and transformative. To touch, see, or even contemplate the symbol was to participate in a tradition stretching back thousands of years, connecting the European practitioner to the hidden wisdom of Egyptian initiates. Understanding this esoteric language requires recognizing patterns, correspondences, and repetitions across time and geography. The recurrence of solar motifs, serpents, sacred geometry, and coded numbers is not coincidental. Each instance acts as a breadcrumb, guiding the careful observer along a hidden path of knowledge. The codices, symbols, and manuscripts together form a map, a guide for those capable of decoding the continuity of hidden wisdom. Through them, the teachings of Egyptian cults survive in Europe, often unrecognized, quietly influencing the rituals, philosophies, and even political structures of the continent. As we continue this journey, the symbols and codices serve as both guideposts and keys, unlocking doors to deeper mysteries. Their presence in European art, architecture, and ritual suggests a deliberate effort to preserve knowledge across generations. By examining these codes, we begin to understand how hidden traditions traveled from the Nile to the courts and secret societies of Europe, shaping bloodlines, influencing culture, and ensuring that even in the shadows, the legacy of the Egyptian initiates endures. Legends of the Holy Grail have fascinated storytellers, mystics, and historians for centuries. Tales of a sacred cup, a vessel of divine power, and a secret of ultimate wisdom have captured imaginations across Europe. But what if the Grail, as we know it, is not a purely European invention? Some researchers propose a deeper, hidden lineage, tracing the Grail myth back to the initiatory cults of ancient Egypt. In this view, the Grail is more than a chalice. It is a symbol, a repository, and a guide, a cipher linking European legends to esoteric knowledge preserved by Egyptian priests for millennia. To understand this connection, one must first consider what the Grail represents. beyond its popular depiction as a cup of miraculous healing or eternal life. The Grail has long been associated with sacred knowledge, spiritual transformation, and the continuity of lineage. These are precisely the qualities cherished by the hidden cults of Egypt. Among the solar mysteries and other secret orders, initiates pursued not only enlightenment, but the mastery of life's mysteries, often encoded in rituals and symbols that could survive generations. The Grail, in this context, can be seen as an allegorical continuation of those practices, a vessel for knowledge and spiritual empowerment rather than a physical object alone. The imagery surrounding the Grail echoes Egyptian symbolism in remarkable ways. Consider the themes of purification, initiation, and the journey from darkness to light, central both to Grail legends and to Egyptian rites. Initiates in the temples of Ammonius or in the solar mysteries underwent tests and rituals designed to cleanse the mind, body, and spirit. They sought to transcend the ordinary, aligning themselves with cosmic forces and attaining a higher state of understanding. Similarly, Grail seekers in medieval Europe embarked on quests that demanded moral, intellectual, and spiritual trials, often guided by cryptic signs, mysterious mentors, or allegorical lessons. The parallels suggest that the Grail legends may have absorbed, consciously or unconsciously, practices rooted in Egyptian esoteric traditions. Bloodlines also play a critical role in this connection. In Egypt, knowledge and ritual were often transmitted through select lineages, ensuring continuity of wisdom and spiritual authority. European Grail myths similarly emphasize the importance of noble or sacred blood. Knights, kings, and chosen individuals are repeatedly portrayed as inheritors of a divine or mystical lineage, uniquely capable of understanding or guarding the Grail. Some historians speculate that these narratives are not mere storytelling, but echoes of real historical traditions in which certain European families maintained secret connections to the initiatory wisdom of Egypt. Symbols, rituals, and codes embedded within noble houses could have acted as repositories of knowledge, much like the Grail itself. The Grail's connection to water and chalices may also reflect Egyptian influence. In many initiation rituals, water symbolized purification, renewal, and the cycle of life, a principle central to Egyptian spirituality, particularly in relation to the Nile and its sacred inundations. Egyptian priests used ceremonial vessels and rites that involved symbolic transformation, often connected to the concept of eternal life or spiritual rebirth. The Grail, in its various medieval representations, often functions similarly, as a vessel that sustains, purifies, and transmits knowledge or life force. The continuity is subtle but striking, suggesting that these European myths may have inherited conceptual frameworks from the Nile's ancient mystics. Medieval European literature provides further evidence of this connection. Texts such as the Arthurian cycles, Chrétien de Troyes narratives, and the later Grail romances contain layers of symbolism that scholars have struggled to decode. Hidden within the stories are references to sun worship, sacred geometry, and transformative trials, all resonant with Egyptian practices. Some researchers argue that these elements were not invented anew in Europe, but were preserved, transmitted, and adapted from older initiatory systems. In essence, the Grail became a European vessel for ancient knowledge, cloaked in narrative and allegory, yet echoing the mysteries of the Egyptian priesthood. The idea of the Grail as a vessel of knowledge also aligns with the function of secret societies and orders in Europe. The Knights Templar, Rosicrucians, and other esoteric groups are often associated with the protection of sacred knowledge, sometimes linked to the Grail itself. These orders, founded centuries after the decline of Egyptian influence, may have inherited fragments of initiatory wisdom indirectly. Symbols, rituals, and codices passed down through generations could have maintained continuity, embedding Egyptian-inspired principles within European mystical and noble traditions. In this way, the Grail functions as a bridge, connecting ancient Egyptian spirituality with European esotericism. Even the mystical geography of Grail myths hints at Egyptian influence. Grail stories often center on remote, hidden, or sacred locations, a forest, a castle, or a mystical isle. In Egypt, temples and sacred sites were similarly designed as isolated, protected spaces where initiates could encounter the divine. The secrecy and symbolism inherent in both landscapes reinforced the continuity of the tradition. These physical and allegorical spaces were not random. They were carefully chosen to preserve knowledge, protect the initiate, and maintain the integrity of esoteric teachings. In considering the Grail's enduring fascination, it becomes clear that its power lies in its dual nature, both as a literal vessel and as a symbolic repository of wisdom. It bridges worlds, connecting the tangible and intangible, the earthly and the divine, the past and the present. Just as the Egyptian cults preserved knowledge through coded rituals and symbols, the Grail narratives preserved esoteric principles within allegory and myth. For those attuned to the hidden patterns, the Grail is not merely a story, but a continuation of a much older, carefully protected tradition. The Grail connection also deepens our understanding of Europe's hidden bloodlines. If knowledge was transmitted selectively through families, rituals, and secret orders, then the Grail myths may serve as both allegorical record and warning, that certain lineages are entrusted with secrets too powerful for the general populace. These narratives act as vessels themselves, encoding information about spiritual mastery, moral responsibility, and the continuity of sacred knowledge across generations. The Grail is simultaneously symbol, story, and lineage, a living echo of the Egyptian mysteries that inspired it. By tracing these connections, we begin to see the Grail not as an isolated European invention, but as part of a broader, transcontinental continuum of esoteric knowledge. From the hidden temples of Egypt to the secretive courts and noble families of Europe, the Grail embodies the preservation, transmission, and safeguarding of wisdom that transcends borders and centuries. It is a testament to the enduring power of initiation, symbol, and lineage, a reminder that beneath the surface of familiar myths lies a deeper, hidden history waiting to be discovered. As the knowledge of ancient Egypt migrated across continents, it did not remain dormant. It found new life within the cloisters, castles, and courts of Europe, often concealed under layers of secrecy. Secret societies and hidden orders became the custodians of this knowledge, ensuring its survival through centuries of political upheaval, religious suppression, and cultural transformation. These groups were not merely clubs or philosophical circles. They were carefully structured networks dedicated to preserving, interpreting, and passing on the esoteric wisdom inherited from Egyptian initiates. Their influence, though subtle, may have shaped the spiritual, intellectual, and political landscape of Europe in ways largely invisible to the public eye. Among the most famous of these groups are the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians, whose rituals, symbols, and teachings bear remarkable resemblance to the principles of Egyptian cults. The Freemasons, for example, place great emphasis on initiation, moral and spiritual development, and symbolic architecture. Their ceremonies often incorporate geometric patterns, sacred numbers, and allegorical storytelling, all echoes of the symbolic systems first cultivated by the solar mysteries and other Egyptian orders. The Rosicrucians, with their focus on alchemical transformation, spiritual enlightenment, and hidden wisdom, similarly reflect the Egyptian emphasis on initiatory progression and the preservation of secret knowledge. These societies, while operating in European contexts, acted as bridges to a far older tradition, preserving the continuity of wisdom across time and geography. The structure of these secret orders was deliberate and hierarchical, often designed to protect knowledge while ensuring its careful transmission. Initiates progressed through graded levels, each stage revealing more profound truths, much like the Egyptian mystery schools. Entry was selective, requiring dedication, moral integrity, and sometimes noble lineage. The secrecy was crucial, not to instill fear, but to safeguard knowledge that in untrained hands could be misunderstood, misused, or lost. The lessons of Egyptian priesthoods, encoded in ritual, symbol, and oral transmission, were adapted to European societies in ways that preserve their essence while allowing them to survive the scrutiny of powerful institutions such as the church. Symbols again played a central role. Just as Egyptian initiates used hieroglyphs, sacred geometry, and ritualized gestures to encode and transmit knowledge, European secret societies developed their own esoteric languages. Masonic lodges, for instance, are filled with allegorical tools, the compass, square, pillars, and temples, that serve not merely as decoration, but as carriers of philosophical and spiritual principles. Rosicrucian texts use symbolism to encode principles of alchemy, cosmology, and spiritual development, echoing the methodical layering of meaning seen in Egyptian codices. These symbols allowed members to recognize shared understanding and maintain continuity of practice even when dispersed across regions or generations. The influence of hidden orders extended beyond philosophy into politics and culture. European rulers often relied on trusted advisors who were members of such societies, granting them access to esoteric guidance and strategic counsel derived from long-preserved knowledge. In some cases, these orders may have functioned as unseen networks of influence, shaping policy, diplomacy, and cultural patronage. While their reach was not absolute, the ability to advise, educate, and connect individuals across borders made them powerful conduits for the transmission of hidden wisdom. Initiates could subtly guide rulers, embedding knowledge into law, ritual, and governance without exposing its origin or full depth. Another critical aspect of these secret societies was their preservation of bloodline knowledge. Just as the Egyptian cults carefully selected families for transmission of initiatory wisdom, European orders often recognized the importance of lineage. Certain families were seen as particularly suited to carry the legacy of hidden knowledge, either through their moral character, intellectual aptitude, or ancestral connections. Marriages, mentorship, and inheritance were all carefully orchestrated to ensure that sacred wisdom remained within trusted circles. This deliberate cultivation of bloodlines helped maintain the integrity of teachings across centuries, linking modern European elites to a distant and esoteric past. The resilience of these orders is striking. Despite persecution, suppression, or the shifting tides of history, they adapted. Some went underground, operating in secrecy while outwardly conforming to the dominant culture. Others adopted allegorical narratives, embedding hidden teachings in literature, architecture, and ritual performance. The adaptability of these societies ensured that knowledge survived even when its original context was lost. Today, echoes of these ancient orders can still be found in lodges, private societies, and the ceremonial practices of modern esoteric movements, demonstrating a lineage that stretches from the Nile to contemporary Europe. The rituals of these societies were not purely symbolic. They were experiential, designed to cultivate insight, discipline, and spiritual awareness. Initiates were often subjected to trials, mental, moral, and sometimes physical, that tested their commitment and readiness to receive deeper knowledge. These rites were reminiscent of Egyptian initiation ceremonies, where the aspirant's understanding of cosmic order, sacred geometry, and metaphysical principles was gradually revealed. Each level of progression brought new insights, ensuring that knowledge was not merely inherited but earned, experienced, and internalized. Ultimately, hidden orders and secret societies served as both guardians and conduits of knowledge. They preserved what could have been lost, adapted teachings for new contexts, and provided continuity in an ever-changing world. Their presence suggests that the migration of Egyptian wisdom into Europe was not accidental or sporadic. It was deliberate, methodical, and sustained. The initiates, the symbols, the codices, and the rituals collectively ensured that a legacy spanning millennia could survive, hidden in plain sight, within the structures, families, and institutions of European society. As we explore these secret orders, it becomes clear that their influence reaches far beyond the esoteric. They are threads connecting continents, centuries, and bloodlines, a hidden network that safeguards knowledge from Egypt's temples to Europe's courts and lodges. By understanding their structure, purpose, and methods, we gain insight into the extraordinary continuity of wisdom and the careful stewardship that allowed it to survive across time, waiting for those prepared to recognize its signs. Across the dim corridors of European history, a quiet thread winds its way through the centuries, an inheritance of symbols, rituals, and whispered knowledge that many researchers believe originated not in medieval castles or monastic libraries, but in the sun-bleached temples of ancient Egypt. When we speak of the Templars, the Rosicrucians, and the early esoteric brotherhoods of Europe, we often picture cloaked figures gathering in flickering candlelight, deciphering secret texts or guarding forbidden treasures. But what rarely comes to mind is Egypt, the land of the Black Earth, where priest-kings once walked in procession beneath towering pylons, and where the mysteries of life, death, and rebirth were codified into initiatory rites thousands of years before these European orders even existed. Yet the connections are there, woven into architecture, symbols, and the strange obsessions of men who claim to be custodians of a knowledge older than the world they inherited. The Knights Templar are often portrayed as warrior monks sworn to poverty and obedience, their white mantles marked only by a simple red cross. But beneath that austere facade, the order possessed layers of secrecy. They were builders, bankers, explorers, and, many argue, collectors of relics and ancient wisdom. Their long stay in the Holy Land put them close to Egypt's borders, and some chronicles hint at Templar envoys traveling further south than officially recorded. A few obscure manuscripts reference Templar excavations not only beneath the Temple Mount, but along older trade routes that once connected Palestine to the Nile. From these travels came rumors of hidden chambers, forbidden scrolls, and symbols carved into stone that resembled the signs of forgotten Egyptian cults rather than Christian iconography. One of the most persistent theories suggests the Templars came into contact with remnants of Egyptian initiatory groups, perhaps descendants of priestly families displaced over centuries of invasions. These priests, so the story goes, guarded fragments of Hermetic teachings and rites of spiritual transformation. Whether the Templars adopted these ideas intentionally or absorbed them through cultural osmosis, their legacy reflects unmistakable echoes. The emphasis on sacred geometry, the fascination with Solomon's temple as a symbolic gateway, the peculiar reverence for the number 3, and the belief that true enlightenment required passing through hidden stages of knowledge, ideas deeply rooted in Egyptian temple schools. When the Templar order fell, many of their members vanished into the shadows of Europe. Some blended into noble families. Others became stonemasons or fleeing scholars, and still others, if the legends are true, carried with them fragments of the Egyptian mysteries. Their influence did not disappear. Instead, it reemerged in subtler, more philosophical forms within groups that began to surface in the centuries that followed. The Rosicrucians, who first appeared in Europe in the early 1600s, proclaimed themselves heirs of ancient wisdom. Their manifestos described a secret brotherhood guided by a mysterious founder who had traveled extensively through Arabia and the Near East, learning from sages, mystics, and guardians of forgotten temples. Egypt, though only hinted at, loomed heavily in their symbolism. The imagery of the rose and cross, the cryptic references to cosmic rebirth, the emphasis on hidden chambers filled with ancient manuscripts, all mirrored Egyptian concepts of transformation and immortality. Some researchers argue that the Rosicrucian movement was nothing less than a rebirth of esoteric teachings that had survived through underground channels since antiquity. The Rosicrucian fascination with alchemy is especially telling. Medieval and Renaissance alchemists often described their art using language borrowed from Egypt. The revered emerald tablet, attributed to the legendary Hermes Trismegistus, was believed to be of Egyptian origin, perhaps even predating the pyramids. Hermetic philosophy, which underpinned much Rosicrucian thought, focused on the unity of all things, the reflection of the macrocosm in the microcosm, and the idea that true wisdom was not learned but remembered. These ideas echo the theology of Egyptian priesthoods, who saw the universe as a living, interconnected whole shaped by divine order, or ma'at. Over time, the Rosicrucian ideals influenced other secret societies, including strands of Freemasonry. Masonic rituals, with their emphasis on building, symbolism, and initiation, are often linked, sometimes romantically, sometimes credibly, to ancient Egyptian rites. The imagery used in early Masonic manuscripts features suns, pillars, compasses, and even stylized representations of the Eye of Providence, all of which bear resemblance to Egyptian temple iconography. While mainstream historians caution against drawing direct lineage from Egypt to Freemasonry, the symbolic parallels are undeniable. The Egyptologists of the Enlightenment, many of whom were Masons themselves, helped reinforce this connection by presenting Egyptian civilization as the cradle of hidden knowledge. As these groups evolved, they revived not only symbols but mental frameworks. They believed the ancient world concealed truths too powerful for the uninitiated, and that these truths have been passed down through chosen lineages, sometimes literal bloodlines, sometimes spiritual ones. For many esoteric thinkers, the fall of Egypt was not the end of its wisdom, but the beginning of its journey into concealed channels, waiting to resurface when the world was ready. This belief fed the idea that European elites, scholars, or initiated families might be guardians of ancient cosmic secrets, a concept deeply attractive to those who saw themselves on the edge of a grand historical tapestry. Even in later centuries, during the age of exploration and early archaeology, secret societies maintained a special fascination with Egyptian monuments. Travelers' journals from the 1700s are filled with cryptic remarks about rituals performed near ruins, inscriptions traced into notebooks, and attempts to decipher hieroglyphs long before Champollion succeeded. Some explorers claim to experience a strange sense of déjà vu when walking through temples such as Dendera or Edfu, as if remembering a legacy buried somewhere beyond conscious reach. Whether this was imagination or something deeper, it only strengthened the romantic perception that Europe and Egypt were connected through more than trade or conquest. They shared an unseen heritage. By the time the modern era arrived, these ideas had blended into a powerful undercurrent in Western esotericism. Secret societies adopted Egyptian symbols as badges of authority, not merely for aesthetic appeal, but because they believed those symbols represented the oldest surviving language of spiritual truth. Within this mindset, the Templars were not only knights, but vessels of ancient wisdom. The Rosicrucians were not merely philosophers, but custodians of esoteric lineage, and the mystics and Masons who followed them were architects of a quiet revival, a reawakening of teachings thought lost after the disappearance of the last Egyptian priesthoods. What remains today are fragments, rituals whose original meanings are obscured, symbols whose roots reach deep into Africa's ancient sands, and myths suggesting that knowledge once reserved for pharaohs and high priests traveled across continents and centuries. Whether these connections reflect true historical transmission or centuries of imaginative reconstruction, they form a captivating narrative, one in which Europe's most enigmatic groups did far more than guard secrets. They preserved echoes of a world where wisdom was power, lineage was destiny, and the mysteries of the universe were carved into stone beneath the blazing Egyptian sun. Across the royal courts of Europe, hidden beneath the velvet of crowns and the gilded surfaces of coats of arms, lies a web of symbols that historians have struggled to explain. These symbols, serpents' suns, bees, lotus-like flowers, winged discs, and stylized eyes, appear in unexpected places, woven into the identity of families who ruled vast empires. To the casual observer, their decorative motifs, simple ornaments pass through generations. Yet to the attentive mind, they form a riddle. Why do so many European dynasties preserve imagery that resembles the ceremonial language of ancient Egypt? The surface story is well known. Royal heraldry, we are told, reflects battles, alliances, marriages, or geographical influences. But deeper layers of history suggest something stranger. Many European royal families emerged abruptly in the historical record, carrying symbols whose origins do not match their lands or supposed ancestry. Some families appeared with no clear lineage, no documented migration, and no traceable ethnic roots, yet they clung to ancient motifs with remarkable consistency. These patterns have led some researchers to consider the possibility that royal houses preserved not only political authority, but fragments of a very old, very guarded tradition, one that may stretch back to priestly orders on the banks of the Nile. The most intriguing examples come from families whose power shaped continents. The Habsburgs, for instance, rose from relative obscurity to dominate European politics for centuries. Their heraldry includes the double-headed eagle, often linked to the Byzantine Empire, but also reminiscent of Egyptian solar symbolism, where twin guardians flanked the rising sun. In Egyptian art, the falcon of Horus and the vulture of Nekhbet stood as protectors of divine kingship. The Habsburg eagle, a creature with two faces looking in opposite directions, suggests both temporal and spiritual authority, a theme that resonates with ancient concepts of dual sovereignty. Then there is the symbol of the bee, which appears in multiple royal houses throughout Europe, but with particular prominence in the lines that claimed ancient, even mythic origins. Bees were sacred in Egypt, associated with royalty since the earliest dynastic period. The title of the pharaoh included the phrase, "he of the sedge and the bee," symbolizing the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt. Bees represented resurrection, immortality, and the continuity of the royal line. The Merovingians, centuries later, used golden bees as insignia, tiny emblems placed in their tombs and stitched on his ceremonial garments. Napoleon, seeking to legitimize his rule, deliberately revived the bee symbol, believing it connected him to an ancient and almost supernatural lineage. Yet historians have never fully explained how such a distinctly pharaonic emblem traveled into European royal iconography with such force. The Stuarts of Scotland and England offer another puzzle. Their symbolism includes the unicorn, a creature often interpreted through Christian lenses. However, the unicorn's deeper meanings tie back to Near Eastern and African mythologies, where horned animals were linked to fertility gods, cosmic cycles, and divine protection. The Stuart fascination with sacred kingship, prophecy, and celestial alignment mirrors practices found not in medieval Europe, but in the temples of Luxor and Karnak. Their coronation rituals, with their emphasis on sacred oil, chosen lineage, and the king as a quasi-priestly figure, echo Egyptian traditions more than they do Germanic or Roman ones. Some of the oldest noble families in Europe went even further. They guarded symbols in private chambers, carved them into the architecture of secret chapels, and embedded them in genealogical records. Serpent imagery, an unmistakable hallmark of several Egyptian cults, appears across aristocratic crests in southern France, northern Italy, and parts of Germany. The serpent was not merely a creature in Egyptian thought. It symbolized protection, knowledge, hidden wisdom, and the cyclical nature of life. In some European families, the serpent is paired with a wing or a crown, forming depictions unerringly similar to Wadjet, the cobra goddess who guarded the pharaoh. Other symbols defy conventional explanation altogether. The winged sun disk, one of the most recognizable emblems from Egyptian temples, appears discreetly in Renaissance manuscripts commissioned by noble patrons. Lotus-like flowers, which have no native presence in Europe, decorate royal furniture and ceremonial objects, often without any stylistic justification. Even the eye motif, sometimes stylized, sometimes overt, appears in royal insignia long before it becomes associated with modern secret societies. What makes these parallels compelling is not simply their existence, but their concentration among families linked by marriage, alliance, or shared ancestry. Many of these families trace their origins to shadowy founders who arrived from the south, from islands beyond the sea, or from lands lost to time. These vague descriptions, repeated in chronicles and oral traditions, hint that European elites may have preserved cultural memories of ancient migrations or contacts far older than written documents record. The persistence of Egyptian symbolism in royal architecture deepens the mystery. Certain palaces and estates contain rooms designed with proportions matching sacred geometry found in Egyptian temples. Decorative choices, sunburst ceilings, lion-headed columns, stylized papyrus patterns, are sometimes so deliberate that they cannot be attributed to coincidence. Royal architects often belong to esoteric circles, suggesting that their patrons wanted specific motifs preserved as part of a hidden lineage or spiritual identity. Coronation rituals offer another layer of intrigue. European monarchs were anointed with sacred oil in ceremonies that had no clear biblical precedent. Instead, they resembled the Egyptian rites in which divine essence was conferred through consecration, merging the king with sacred heritage. Some coronation regalia, scepters, orbs, and certain crowns, carry shapes and engravings that match the regalia of Egyptian pharaohs more closely than the objects of early European chieftains. Even the posture of monarchs during anointing ceremonies mirrors the iconography seen on temple walls describing the raising of a priest-king. While mainstream historians attribute these parallels to cultural borrowing or Renaissance fascination with antiquity, the consistency and depth of the symbolism suggest something more deliberate. These royal families acted not merely as rulers, but as stewards of ancient memory. They guarded symbols that did not belong to their land or era, as though preserving a thread that connected them to a forgotten past. Even when political tides changed and new dynasties rose, the symbols endured, passed quietly from generation to generation. In private correspondence, some nobles wrote of the old ways, the ancient fathers, or the wisdom of the first lands. These cryptic phrases rarely appear in public documents, but in personal writings, they hint at a belief that their family lines carried something older than recorded European history. Whether this referred to bloodline, spiritual inheritance, or symbolic tradition remains uncertain. But the secrecy surrounding these beliefs suggests that they were considered too potent or too unusual for open discussion. In the modern era, genealogical studies, while scientifically cautious, have revealed unexpected patterns linking certain European dynasties to genetic markers common in North Africa and the Near East. Though not definitive proof of Egyptian ancestry, these findings support the broader possibility of migrations and intermarriages long before medieval Europe took shape. What lingers today is the impression of a hidden continuity, a faint but undeniable echo of an older world carried within the identities of Europe's ruling families. Their symbols hint at stories that never made it into the history books, stories shaped not by battles or treaties, but by ancient lineages, sacred traditions, and a mysterious inheritance passed through centuries of power. Whether literal or symbolic, these connections suggest that the royalty of Europe may not have been merely political figures, but custodians of a legacy whose origins lie far beyond their own lands, in the sunlit temples of a civilization that shaped the imagination of the world. Across the dim vaults of museums and the forgotten storage rooms of private collections, there are objects that simply do not belong where they were found, items that should never have existed in Europe but somehow did. These artifacts, often dismissed, mislabeled, or quietly locked away, form one of the most puzzling threads in the search for hidden connections between ancient Egypt and early European history. They are not the grand treasures displayed behind glass, but subtle, unsettling remnants. A fragment of carved stone discovered in a medieval monastery, a miniature figurine found in a Celtic burial mound, a scrap of papyrus preserved inside an illuminated manuscript. Each one raises a question, and together they whisper the possibility of a forgotten story. One of the most striking examples surfaced in southern France during the 19th century. Local workers renovating an old chapel discovered a smooth black stone buried beneath the floor. The artifact bore faint carvings, symbols that did not match Christian motifs or European medieval art. Instead, they resembled the delicate lines used in Egyptian funerary inscriptions. A visiting scholar identified what appeared to be the feather of Maat, the symbol of truth and cosmic balance. When experts examined the piece, the debate erupted. Was the stone an import from antiquity, carried across continents by traders or pilgrims? Or was it something more perplexing? Evidence of a ritual object carried by an unknown group claiming spiritual lineage from Egypt? The artifact disappeared shortly afterward into a private collection, leaving behind nothing but sketches and a controversy the academic world preferred to forget. Similar mysteries emerged in unexpected places. In the coastal ruins of southwestern England, among the remains of an early medieval settlement, archaeologists unearthed a small bronze statuette of a falcon with crown-like markings. The craftsmanship was not Egyptian in full purity, but the influence was undeniable. Falcons adorned with royal crowns belonged to Horus, protector of the pharaohs and symbol of divine kingship. How such an object ended up in a remote European site, centuries before widespread contact with the Mediterranean, defied explanation. Some argued it was a Roman import, but the dating suggested otherwise. Others proposed Celtic imitation, yet the style did not match local traditions. The statuette sat uneasily in museum records, too anomalous to explain, too significant to ignore. Another enigmatic relic surfaced in a monastery library in northern Italy. Hidden within the binding of a medieval prayer book was a small fragment of papyrus. It contained faded characters written in a script that resembled Demotic Egyptian. The fragment appeared to be part of a funerary hymn, possibly recited by low-ranking priests. How it arrived inside a Christian manuscript compiled centuries later remains a mystery. Scholars initially assumed it had been reused as scrap material by scribes, who often recycled parchment or papyrus. But the presence of Egyptian script in that region, in that period, was highly unusual. It suggested that someone within the monastery had once possessed a cache of foreign texts, likely obtained through secretive channels. The papyrus fragment was quietly removed from the manuscript and placed in an archive. Its existence is known only through a brief entry in an old catalog. Beyond individual artifacts, entire clusters of objects have raised eyebrows. Along trade routes in the Iberian Peninsula, excavators found beads carved from materials not native to Europe, engraved with symbols resembling the Ankh, the Egyptian sign of life. These beads often appear in graves belonging not to merchants but to local elites, suggesting that whoever placed them there attributed special significance to them. In some cases, the beads were arranged in patterns reminiscent of protective amulets used by Egyptian priesthoods, though adapted to local burial customs. Whether these objects arrived through trade or were carried by migrants remains uncertain, but their presence hints at an exchange far deeper than simple commerce. In central Germany, an even stranger discovery was made during the excavation of an old castle's foundation. Workers uncovered fragments of a wooden chest, inside which lay a collection of items: an ivory comb decorated with lotus motifs, a small clay tablet bearing a stylized sun disk, and several beads made from materials found in the eastern Mediterranean. The chest's contents were dated to roughly the same period as the castle's earliest construction, suggesting these items belonged to someone of importance. Historians speculated that a crusader may have brought them back from travels, yet the chronology did not match known military expeditions. Others theorized that the objects were heirlooms passed down through generations. The sun disk carving, in particular, bore striking resemblance to the winged Aten symbol used during the Amarna period in Egypt. That such a motif would resurface in a European castle hinted at connection scholars were reluctant to consider. One of the most controversial artifacts emerged in the Highlands of Scotland: a stone panel carved with serpentine designs and crowned with a stylized solar emblem. The piece was found embedded in an early medieval fortification, far from any known Roman or Mediterranean contact. The carving technique suggested local stoneworkers, but the symbols did not. The serpent crowned by the sun was an unmistakable echo of Egyptian and Near Eastern iconography, often associated with divine guardianship or hidden knowledge. When researchers attempted to fit the carving into existing cultural frameworks, it resisted categorization. It did not match Pictish, Celtic, or Saxon styles. It stood alone, a silent anomaly suggesting the presence of an outside influence, perhaps even a small group of foreigners whose cultural memory shaped their art. In some cases, the controversies deepened when the items hinted at ritual use. A small stone vessel found in Austria, made from imported alabaster, bore scorch marks and traces of oils used in ancient embalming practices. Though not definitively Egyptian, the mixture of substances was similar to those identified in mummification chambers. Was it a mere curiosity brought home by a traveler, or a ceremonial object maintained by a group preserving older spiritual traditions? Historians often responded to such anomalies with discomfort. The simplest explanations, trade, imitation, coincidence, were invoked, yet these answers rarely addressed the deeper pattern. The artifacts consistently appeared in places linked to early noble families, remote strongholds, or monastic centers with reputations for esoteric knowledge. They surfaced in regions associated with legends of founders arriving from distant lands, or stories of ancient teachers who brought the wisdom of the first peoples. Whether these objects represent physical proof of Egyptian priestly lineages traveling into Europe, or whether they hint at forgotten forms of long-distance cultural exchange, they challenge the conventional timeline of history. They sit at the edges of what scholars deem acceptable, creating a quiet tension between orthodox history and the unsettling possibility that Europe's earliest elites inherited not just power, but relics of a civilization far older than their own. Each artifact may be small, but together they form a mosaic of intrigue, a scattered trail of breadcrumbs leading back toward an ancient source. And though many of these items now rest in dusty archives or private vaults, their presence whispers of a hidden continuity, that the echoes of Egypt did not fade in the desert winds, but traveled, carried by hands determined to preserve secrets the world was not ready to remember. In recent years, science has offered a new set of tools to examine the mysteries of the past. DNA analysis, population genetics, and ancient genome sequencing have provided insights that earlier generations could only imagine. Yet even with these advances, The question of ancestry remains a double-edged sword. For every discovery that brings clarity, another introduces unsettling ambiguity. And for those searching for traces of ancient Egypt within Europe's noble lines, the genetic landscape is both tantalizing and frustrating, filled with hints that refuse to resolve into certainty. The idea that blood can carry hidden stories resonates deeply with human imagination. The royals of Europe maintained strict marriage patterns for centuries, often intermarrying within a small cluster of elite families. This practice created what geneticists call bottlenecks, points in history where small founder groups shaped the biological future of entire dynasties. If, as some theories suggest, families with Near Eastern or North African heritage entered early European nobility, then faint genetic echoes might still be detectable today. But the signals are faint, often obscured by centuries of intermarriage, wars, migrations, and political upheavals. The challenge lies in distinguishing coincidence from continuity, statistical noise from ancient narrative. Among the most intriguing clues are certain haplogroups, genetic markers passed through maternal or paternal lines. Some of these markers, rare in general European populations, appear at unusual frequencies among specific noble factions. One such lineage, connected to regions historically linked to ancient Egypt and the Levant, has surfaced sporadically in genetic studies of individuals claiming descent from medieval aristocracies. Though not definitive proof of Egyptian ancestry, these findings open the door to possibilities. They suggest long-distance migrations or intermarriages that traditional history never documented, or the silent survival of a lineage that carried memories of older lands. Complicating matters, the genetic patterns that connect Europe to the Near East are far older and more widespread than many people expect. Throughout the Neolithic and Bronze Age, large-scale movements of people traveled across continents, carrying culture, knowledge, and biological heritage. Some of these ancient groups settled in Europe long before written history began. They blended into local populations, forming the substratum from which medieval societies emerged. But what makes the case of Europe's ruling houses unusual is their tendency to preserve certain traits with striking persistence. These traits, dark hair among otherwise fair populations, distinctive facial structures, unique metabolic markers, show up in portraits, medical records, and genealogies. They hint at an ancestry that diverged from the surrounding population in subtle but meaningful ways. While mainstream geneticists caution against romanticizing these connections, even they acknowledge that elite families often diverge genetically from common populations due to selective marriage practices. Over time, such divergence can preserve fragments of ancestry long erased in the broader demographic landscape. If a small group bearing North African or Near Eastern genetic signatures integrated into early European nobility, and if those families remained endogamous for generations, then traces of that origin could easily persist in modern times. One of the most controversial aspects of this subject arises from the study of ancient mummies. When scientists sampled DNA from several Egyptian mummies, they found genetic signatures linking some individuals to populations in the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean. These findings surprised many, but they also underscored a long-known reality. Egypt was a crossroads of civilizations. Its priestly castes and ruling families were not isolated. They interacted with, intermarried, and exchanged knowledge with neighboring cultures. If members of these castes migrated during periods of political collapse, they may have carried both cultural traditions and genetic heritage into new lands. But the link between ancient Egypt and Europe is not limited to Bronze Age migrations. Medieval records describe envoys, scholars, and travelers moving between the Mediterranean world and Europe. Some of these individuals belong to families with deep roots in North Africa. Their descendants occasionally married into minor noble houses, especially in southern Europe. Over generations, these connections created a subtle genetic thread woven into the tapestry of aristocratic bloodlines. Though often unacknowledged, these ties contributed to the diversity seen in historical portraits and personal descriptions of noble clans. Modern genetic studies have occasionally sparked quiet debate within academic circles. A few researchers noted unexpected markers in DNA samples tied to European aristocracy. These markers showed affinities with populations in Egypt's Nile Delta, Sudan, and the Levant. Critics argue that such similarities could arise from ancient pan-Mediterranean gene flow. Supporters counter that the patterns appear too concentrated, too specific, to attribute solely to prehistoric movement. Neither side can conclusively prove its case, leaving the conversation suspended between possibility and skepticism. More intriguing still are the whispered accounts of private genetic testing carried out by certain families. Though rarely discussed openly, a handful of nobles have commissioned studies into their own deep ancestry. The results, according to scattered anecdotes, revealed unexpected lineages not typically associated with European royalty. Whether these findings were suppressed out of caution, curiosity, or discomfort remains unknown. But the mere fact that such tests occurred suggests that the idea of ancient connections has not died. It has simply moved behind closed doors. At the heart of the debate is a deeper question. What does heritage mean when it stretches beyond geography and into the realm of myth? For some, the allure lies not in blood itself, but in the story it carries. If European dynasties contain even faint traces of Egyptian lineage, it challenges the conventional narrative of Western civilization. It suggests that Europe's noble houses may not have been purely products of local tribes or Roman legacies, but heirs, however indirectly, to priestly systems older than Greek philosophy and Roman law. Genetics alone cannot tell this story. Numbers and markers offer hints, not certainties. Yet the scientific data, when viewed alongside symbolic traditions, unexplained artifacts, and persistent cultural echoes, forms a mosaic that invites deeper reflection. Perhaps the true inheritance of the ancient world was not only biological, but spiritual and intellectual. Perhaps the transmission of lineage carried with it the transmission of ideas, structures of thought that shaped how elites understood power, legitimacy, and the cosmos. In the quiet laboratories where ancient DNA is extracted from crumbling bone, and in the secure archives where private genealogies are preserved, the boundaries between science and mystery blur. The deeper researchers dig, the more they encounter paradoxes that challenge linear history. Genetic signals that should not be there. Outliers that defy statistical models. Patterns that echo long-forgotten myths. Whether these findings represent a genuine connection to the priestly lineages of Egypt or merely reflect the immense complexity of human migration, they remind us that ancestry is never simple. It is a labyrinth of forgotten paths, converging and diverging across thousands of years. In that labyrinth, Europe's ancient bloodlines may yet carry secrets waiting to be understood. Secrets written not in ink or stone, but in the silent language of the human genome. Throughout centuries of human storytelling, the boundary between myth and historical memory has always been porous. Civilizations rise, fall, and leave behind fragments, objects, rituals, symbols, and lines of descent that survive long after their origins have faded from collective memory. In this way, the question of ancient continuity becomes more than an academic exercise. It becomes a meditation on how cultures preserve themselves across vast distances and through periods of upheaval. Section 13 explores this idea by examining how forgotten legacies may live on in unexpected places, carried forward by families, traditions, and subtle markers that endure even when the original context is lost. One of the most compelling aspects of this inquiry lies in the persistence of certain symbols across European aristocratic culture. Long before modern archaeology uncovered detailed knowledge of pharaonic Egypt, heraldic emblems appeared that echoed motifs found in ancient temples and tombs. Animals associated with spiritual guardianship, stylized solar imagery, and geometric patterns resembling those from North Africa all appear in medieval coats of arms. While historians often attribute these similarities to coincidence or to the broad diffusion of Mediterranean symbolism, the parallels remain striking. They raise the possibility that some early European families adopted or inherited symbols from older cultures whose influence stretched further than previously assumed. These cultural echoes, preserved through chivalric orders and ancestral crests, may function as quiet reminders of connections that were once more clearly understood. Another layer of continuity can be seen in the rituals surrounding sovereignty, coronation, and royal legitimacy. Many medieval European coronation rites include gestures and phrases that appear foreign to the local traditions of the time, yet align with spiritual symbolism that traces back to the ancient world. Anointing with oil, ceremonial purification, the use of sacred staffs or rods, and invocations of divine kingship appear in both Egyptian and European contexts. Although the two civilizations were separated by geography and time, the repetition of certain ritualistic elements suggests the survival of older priestly ideas, transmitted through intermediaries or preserved by individuals who carried fragments of knowledge across continents. Some scholars point to the medieval fascination with esoteric learning, alchemy, sacred geometry, and mysticism as evidence of a deeper lineage of thought that predates Greek and Roman philosophy. Hidden societies and scholarly circles guarded knowledge that they believed originated in ancient priestly traditions. Within these enclaves, initiates were expected to demonstrate not only intellectual discipline, but also a form of moral refinement that mirrored the values attributed to ancient Egyptian priesthoods. Whether these groups inherited their ideas directly or reconstructed them out of admiration, their teachings shaped the worldview of influential families. As a result, the intellectual traditions of Europe may have been subtly guided by concepts preserved from epochs much older than the Middle Ages. Stories of migration, exile, and refuge also play a role in this narrative. During periods of turmoil in Egypt, foreign invasions, religious upheavals, and internal conflicts, members of priestly castes and elite families might have sought safety beyond their homeland. Various ancient sources describe individuals fleeing to Mediterranean islands, Ethiopia, the Levant, and even parts of southern Europe. These accounts, although fragmentary, contribute to the idea that cultural and familial legacies could have traveled far from their points of origin. If such migrations occurred, they would have carried not only people, but also traditions, knowledge systems, and possibly lineages that later blended into local societies. Across Europe, scattered legends describe founders of noble clans who arrived mysteriously from distant lands. These stories vary in detail, but many share a common theme. An outsider possessing rare knowledge or extraordinary bearing establishes or revitalizes a lineage. Over time, mythological elements accumulate around these figures, reshaping them into heroic ancestors or semi-divine beings. While historians often dismiss such accounts as imaginative storytelling, they sometimes contain kernels of truth. Oral histories often preserve memories of migrations or cultural exchanges that written records overlook. In this context, the mythic outsider might be more than a narrative device. It could represent a real individual whose origins were exotic enough to be remembered long after specific details faded. The endurance of certain physical traits within some aristocratic families also invites contemplation. Although physical appearance cannot serve as proof of ancestry, repeated descriptions of particular features, such as almond-shaped eyes, elongated skull structures, distinct brow formations, or unusual skin undertones persist in paintings and personal accounts. These attributes appear sporadically across different regions and periods, as though resurfacing intermittently within bloodlines that carried ancient genetic influences. While genetics alone cannot explain such patterns without direct evidence, the visual continuity documented in portraits hints at a complex biological history intertwined with layers of cultural identity. The theme of hidden legacy gains additional weight when one considers the political consciousness of medieval and early modern elites. Many noble families carefully curated their genealogies, often emphasizing connections to prestigious ancient civilizations. In some cases, these claims were symbolic, meant to inspire reverence or justify political authority. But in other cases, the precision of these genealogies and the secrecy with which certain family archives were maintained suggested an awareness of origins that diverged from mainstream historical narratives. Families that guarded their lineages with unusual diligence may have believed they carried a heritage that set them apart not only politically but spiritually. Another striking element is the recurrence of knowledge that appears unexpectedly advanced for its time. Certain architectural innovations, agricultural techniques, and navigational skills introduced by specific elite families seem disproportionately sophisticated compared to their contemporaries. Although human ingenuity cannot be underestimated, the appearance of advanced knowledge in isolated contexts raises questions about its source. Some researchers propose that such knowledge was preserved through oral transmission or through secretive scholarly traditions linked to ancient priestly systems. If so, these intellectual legacies may represent another form of continuity, one that transcends biological lineage and reflects the survival of ideas. The more one examines these threads, symbolic, ritualistic, genealogical, and intellectual, the more difficult it becomes to maintain a rigid separation between the ancient past and later historical eras. Even if direct biological descent cannot be definitively established, the persistence of cultural echoes suggests a deeper form of inheritance. Human history is seldom linear. It is a network of intertwined paths, with knowledge and identity passing through corridors that are often invisible to conventional scholarship. When viewed from this broader perspective, the potential survival of ancient traditions within European aristocracy appears not only possible but plausible. Moreover, the psychological dimension of legacy cannot be ignored. Families often carry forward values and worldviews that shape their behavior across generations. These inherited perspectives influence decisions, alliances, and cultural contributions. In some noble lineages, there exists a palpable sense of guardianship, an awareness of belonging to something older than the documented timeline of their ancestry. This sense of guardianship echoes the ancient concept of lineage as both a privilege and a responsibility, a theme deeply resonant in Egyptian priesthoods. The alignment of these value systems, though not definitive proof of direct descent, suggests a shared philosophical orientation that may have distant origins. Ultimately, the exploration of hidden ancestry is less about discovering a single definitive link and more about recognizing the interconnectedness of human civilization. Borders shift, empires fall, populations merge, but fragments of identity continue to flow across time. What survives is often subtle, a family crest, a ritual gesture, a distinctive facial feature, a fragment of forgotten wisdom preserved in an old manuscript. These remnants form the delicate threads that connect distant eras, reminding us that history is never truly lost. It remains present in the stories we tell, the traditions we preserve, and the quiet mysteries that linger in our bloodlines and cultures. In this light, the legacy of ancient civilizations does not vanish with their physical collapse. Instead, it transforms, adapts, and finds new expressions in unexpected places. Whether carried through genetics, culture, or collective memory, the past lives on, shaping identities in ways that continue to unfold across generations. Across Europe, there are scattered temples, underground chambers, forgotten monasteries, and remote mountain shrines that seem to whisper stories older than the civilizations that surround them. They stand as silent witnesses to a world in which knowledge was transmitted through symbols rather than books, where secrecy protected not only ideas but identities. Many of these sites were constructed during eras when Europe was undergoing profound political and spiritual transitions, times when older traditions were being suppressed, absorbed, or repurposed by newly rising powers. And within these ancient walls, one finds traces of rituals and architectural features that bear an uncanny resemblance to practices associated with Egyptian priesthoods and mystery cults. Whether these similarities result from direct influence or from shared archetypal patterns is a question that continues to provoke debate among scholars and esoteric historians alike. One of the most intriguing aspects of these sites lies in their deliberate use of alignment. The orientation of entrances towards solstices, the placement of chambers corresponding to star positions, and the mathematical precision seen in certain stone arrangements suggest knowledge far beyond what is typically attributed to the cultures credited with their construction. Some of these alignments match patterns used in ancient Egyptian temple complexes, where the architecture acted as both a cosmic mirror and a symbolic device guiding ritual practice. The recurrence of such astronomical precision across distant locations points toward a philosophical worldview centered on harmony between earth and sky, a worldview strongly emphasized in the teachings of Egyptian priesthoods. The question then emerges, who brought these ideas to Europe, and why were they preserved in such isolated and hidden places? In several medieval texts, there are references to wandering sages, architects, and mystics who traveled across Europe carrying strange instruments, unfamiliar measurement systems, and fragments of knowledge that local communities considered exotic. These individuals rarely stayed in one place, often moving from region to region as though following a hidden map. Their influence can be inferred through sudden leaps in construction skill or the abrupt appearance of architectural motifs that had no precedent in local tradition. Some of these motifs appear to be stylized versions of Egyptian symbols, lotus patterns, solar discs, serpent imagery, and geometric proportions reminiscent of sacred Egyptian canon. Though mainstream history views such references as symbolic or allegorical, the recurring descriptions of these knowledge carriers hint at a lineage that long predated the manuscripts which recorded their passing. Beyond architecture, ritual remnants provide further clues. In certain monastic orders and knightly brotherhoods, there existed private ceremonies that differ significantly from the public rites they performed. Some involved purification through water and incense, guided recitation of cosmologically framed invocations, and symbolic reenactments of death and rebirth, elements strikingly similar to the initiation rites described in ancient Egyptian funerary texts and temple inscriptions. These were not public practices, nor were they meant for the wider congregation. Instead, they were reserved for select individuals who had proven their discipline, loyalty, or intellectual capacity. The secrecy surrounding these rituals suggests that they were considered powerful, perhaps transformative, and therefore unsuitable for general dissemination. Their resemblance to Egyptian initiation structures raises the possibility that the orders preserving them were safeguarding fragments of an older, more universal mystery tradition. This continuity of ritual becomes even more intriguing when paired with accounts of hidden libraries. Throughout Europe, legends speak of concealed vaults beneath monasteries, castles, and abandoned abbeys where forbidden or ancient texts were safeguarded. Some of these vaults, according to historical whispers, contain scrolls or codices written in languages that local scholars could not decipher. Rumors claim that certain noble families maintained private scriptoria where selected scribes were trained to copy esoteric manuscripts, ensuring their survival even when public authorities threatened their destruction. Although little direct evidence survives, periodic discoveries of manuscripts containing symbols and diagrams reminiscent of Egyptian theology have kept such legend alive. These documents, often dismissed as medieval inventions or alchemical fantasies, could represent attempts to preserve knowledge originating from much older sources. Another intriguing connection lies in the use of sacred underground spaces. Europe is filled with subterranean chambers whose original functions remain mysterious. Some were later repurposed as crypts or cellars, but their initial designs suggest ceremonial use. The arrangement of these chambers often mirrors the descending pathways found in Egyptian tombs and initiation tunnels, narrow passages leading to larger rooms where light, sound, and shadow play meaningful roles. In some of these European spaces, inscriptions or carvings exist that do not match the known iconography of their region. The motifs are sometimes abstract, sometimes geometric, and occasionally startlingly similar to symbols used by ancient Egyptian cults associated with resurrection and spiritual ascension. It is difficult to determine whether these similarities came through direct transmission or through rediscovery, but their presence contributes to a growing mosaic of connections. The persistence of such sites raises questions about who maintained them during periods when Europe's focus shifted toward Christianization, feudal consolidation, and later, Enlightenment rationalism. Some historians propose that small, closed communities, perhaps remnants of older priestly groups, continued to guard their traditions discreetly, adapting them to new cultural frameworks without abandoning their core principles. Over generations, these groups may have blended into local populations or merged with emerging secret societies, contributing their knowledge to organizations that valued secrecy and spiritual discipline. This theory gains traction when one examines the philosophical underpinnings of various esoteric orders that arose in Europe between the 12th and 17th centuries. Their teachings frequently referenced hidden wisdom from the lands of the sunrise or the kingdoms of the Nile, often describing Egypt as a repository of sacred truth rather than a mere ancient civilization. In northern and central Europe, travelers documented encounters with communities that practiced unique forms of healing and divination. These communities, though small, were reputed to possess knowledge of herbal formulas, star cycles, and spiritual techniques that seemed unusually sophisticated. Some observers noted that their practices resembled those described in ancient Mediterranean sources, including Egyptian medical papyri and temple healing rituals. As the mosaic of ancient connections grows clearer, attention inevitably turns toward the role of modern institutions and governments in shaping what the public is allowed to know. Information, especially when it concerns origins, identity, or the roots of civilization itself, has always been a powerful tool. Throughout history, dominant cultures have curated their narratives carefully, emphasizing certain lineages while minimizing or erasing others. In the modern era, this process has become more refined, assisted by the sophistication of academia, archival control, and the ability to shape public discourse through education and media. Section 15 explores how these layers of influence may contribute to the gradual fading of older, inconvenient truths that could, if acknowledged openly, reshape how humanity views its past. One of the most persistent questions concerns the disappearance of unusual artifacts or documents shortly after their discovery. Researchers, explorers, and independent archaeologists have long reported instances in which items unearthed in Europe appear to contain symbols or inscriptions reminiscent of Egyptian or Near Eastern origin. In several cases, these objects were allegedly transferred to governmental archives for evaluation, only to vanish from the public record. While official explanations typically cite miscataloguing, loss, or reclassification, patterns of sudden disappearance have led to speculation that certain discoveries challenge established timelines or cultural boundaries. If such artifacts genuinely demonstrated early contact or shared lineage between Egypt and parts of Europe, their existence would complicate narratives that portray ancient civilizations as isolated and independently developed. Archaeologists working near old monastic sites, ancient fortresses, and forgotten burial grounds in Europe sometimes report unexpected restrictions placed on their work. Permits are revoked without explanation, excavation zones are reduced, or entire projects are abruptly reassigned to institutional teams with limited transparency. These actions are officially attributed to preservation protocols or concerns about site integrity, but some believe the real issue lies in the potential implications of what might be uncovered. Unusual burial practices, anomalous skull shapes, or artifacts featuring non-local iconography could indicate migration, cultural blending, or elite networks that predates the accepted historical framework. The reluctance to explore these possibilities openly reflects a broader tendency to safeguard the simplicity of mainstream history. Academic institutions, particularly those responsible for teaching ancient history and anthropology, often adopt rigid frameworks that leave little room for alternative interpretations. Students who attempt to explore connections between European aristocracy and ancient priestly cultures may find their research discouraged or dismissed as speculative. This gatekeeping effect, even when not intentional, creates an academic culture in which certain questions cannot be asked without risking credibility. The issue is not that these institutions are malicious, but rather that they have become guardians of a consensus narrative deeply resistant to revision. When entire careers, publications, and educational systems rely on maintaining established historical timelines, challenging that structure becomes not just controversial, but professionally dangerous. Museums, too, play a powerful role in shaping public perception. Exhibits are often curated to present artifacts in a way that supports existing narratives. Items that do not fit neatly into known classifications may be labeled as ritual objects, unknown symbolism, or local variations, effectively neutralizing their disruptive potential. Occasionally, artifacts are placed in storage with the justification that space is limited or that the items require further study, a process that can effectively remove them from public awareness. In rare instances where unusual pieces do appear in exhibitions, their interpretive plaques tend to downplay any suggestion of cross-cultural influence, reinforcing the idea that European civilizations developed independently, untouched by older Eastern traditions. Government involvement in historical curation becomes even more evident when examining how funding is allocated. Research grants often favor projects that align with traditional academic theories. Excavations that investigate mainstream narratives receive generous support, while those seeking to explore peripheral or unconventional hypotheses struggle to secure resources. This imbalance shapes the direction of historical inquiry, creating an ecosystem where inconvenient discoveries are less likely to be made simply because they are less likely to be sought. Over decades, this produces an intellectual environment where only one version of history has the financial means to flourish. Even when alternative findings do emerge, their dissemination is often hindered by institutional processes. Scholarly publications, peer-reviewed journals, and academic conferences serve as gatekeepers of legitimacy. Research that deviates from consensus may be rejected on the grounds of methodology, lack of precedent, or speculative interpretation, even when supported by compelling evidence. This system is designed to maintain academic rigor, but can also suppress innovative or disruptive lines of inquiry. As a result, only fragments of unconventional findings reach the public, often through secondary channels such as documentaries, independent researchers, or private publications. The modern digital era should, in theory, make information more accessible, but it introduces new forms of control. Search engines and online encyclopedias rely on algorithms that rank authoritative sources higher, meaning websites that challenge conventional history are buried beneath layers of officially sanctioned information. While this helps curb misinformation, it also ensures that alternative historical theories, no matter how carefully researched, remain obscure. In some cases, platforms reduce visibility of controversial topics by flagging them as fringe or unverified, shaping public perception before individuals have the chance to evaluate evidence for themselves. One of the most fascinating aspects of institutional shaping is how subtle it often is. Governments rarely issue explicit bans on historical topics. Instead, influence is exerted through funding decisions, school curriculums, museum partnerships, and the approval processes for archaeological research. Over time, these controls create a landscape in which certain questions seem unaskable. For example, asking whether Europe once hosted secretive groups preserving Egyptian priestly traditions may be dismissed as fantastical, not because the question is inherently unreasonable, but because the academic infrastructure has not provided a place for such inquiries to develop. Beyond institutional suppression lies another layer: cultural inertia. Societies become attached to their historical narratives because those narratives shape identity. Acknowledging that European aristocracy may possess hidden connections to ancient Egyptian bloodlines would complicate national stories built on localized origins. It would raise questions about migration, influence, and the interconnectedness of human civilization, questions that challenge modern political boundaries and cultural distinctions. As a result, institutions may resist narratives that blur the lines between cultures, preferring histories that keep civilizations neatly separated. Despite these barriers, the truth has a way of resurfacing. Independent researchers, genetic historians, private archivists, and even hobbyist archaeologists continue to uncover anomalies that defy conventional explanations. Some families still preserve oral histories or heirlooms that hint at origins predating their documented genealogy. And occasionally, a suppressed discovery finds its way into public consciousness, sparking debate that institutions struggle to contain. Each of these moments demonstrates that history is not a fixed narrative, but a fluid tapestry continuously being rewoven. In the quiet hours when the modern world sleeps, when city lights dim and the ancient rhythms beneath our feet grow perceptible again, a profound realization begins to surface. History is not a closed book, nor is it a straight line. It is a living presence, woven through centuries, carried in symbols, preserved in rituals, protected within families, and whispered across generations through channels that rarely appear in official archives. As this journey through hidden cults, forgotten bloodlines, and ancient transmitters of knowledge reaches its conclusion, the deeper truth becomes clear. The past is not gone. It is folded into the present, waiting patiently for those willing to see its patterns. The more one follows these subtle threads, the more apparent it becomes that the world we inhabit has been shaped not only by recorded events, but also by forces that operated quietly in the background. These forces were neither overtly political nor overtly religious. They existed at the intersection of identity, continuity, and sacred knowledge. They belonged to individuals and groups who believed that certain truths were too precious to expose to the chaos of history, too delicate to withstand the erosion of shifting empires, and too transformative to place in the hands of the uninitiated. And so they sheltered those truths through codes, symbols, genealogies, and teachings disguised beneath the surface of everyday life. Throughout Europe, whispers of this ancient continuity have survived in ways both subtle and surprising. A crest bearing unfamiliar symbols whose origins were never fully explained. A ritual performed by a noble family each generation, its meaning lost yet preserved through habit. a manuscript discovered in a private collection referencing rites and star alignments known only to civilizations long vanished. A concealed chamber beneath a monastery containing carvings that should not exist in that geographic region. Each of these pieces, on its own, appears trivial or easily dismissed. Yet when viewed together, they form a quiet constellation, a pattern that suggests a lineage of thought and blood linking Europe to something far older than medieval kingdoms or Roman provinces. This continuity does not manifest in the dramatic ways imagined in fiction. There are no grand councils of ancient families pulling the strings of civilization from behind velvet curtains. Instead, what survives is more refined, more fragile, and perhaps more meaningful. It is a chain of memory, tender, elusive, and resistant to documentation. It is a recognition passed from parent to child in cryptic phrases, in heirlooms that are never fully explained, in the sense that their identity was shaped by forces predating the nations they live within. In some families, this identity remains a shadow. In others, it rests like a quiet flame kept alive across centuries, even when the world around them changed beyond recognition. As modern researchers confront these anomalies, ritual residues, symbolic parallels, genealogical puzzles, and scattered artifacts, a faint outline emerges of an ancient priestly culture that never truly disappeared. Perhaps it did not maintain its temples, its monuments, or its overt authority, but it found new ways to survive. It embedded itself into families that rose to prominence, into scholarly circles that safeguarded forbidden knowledge, into secretive orders that turned ancient spiritual principles into coded teachings. In this form, it avoided detection, avoided persecution, and endured in ways that monumental civilizations could not. What makes this hidden legacy even more compelling is the consistency of the values it carried forward. Whether preserved in esoteric orders, in aristocratic traditions, or in isolated communities, the recurring themes remain strikingly similar: reverence for cosmic cycles, emphasis on inner transformation, belief in duality and balance, recognition of universal order, and the conviction that lineage is not merely biological but spiritual. These ideas resonate strongly with ancient Egyptian teachings, which portray the universe as a harmonious interplay of forces and humanity as a participant in that cosmic rhythm. The survival of these themes in European contexts raises profound questions about how knowledge travels, transforms, and embeds itself in the collective consciousness of distant cultures. Yet the endurance of this ancient legacy also speaks to humanity's deep desire for continuity. Civilizations rise and fall, but the longing to remain connected to something timeless endures. Families protect their histories because they offer meaning. Scholars pursue forbidden knowledge because it offers depth. Societies cling to rituals because they offer a sense of belonging to something larger. And through these impulses, fragments of the ancient world survive in the modern one, preserved by individuals who may not fully understand what they guard, yet feel compelled to protect it nonetheless. As the narrative draws toward its conclusion, a more reflective question emerges. What does it mean for modern humanity if pieces of the ancient world still live within our culture, our traditions, and perhaps even our bloodlines? It suggests that we are not separate from the past, but participants in a journey that began long before our recorded histories. It suggests that our identities are intertwined with civilizations we assume to be long gone. And it suggests that the rigid boundaries between cultures, nations, and epochs are illusions created for convenience. Illusions that crumble when we examine the subtle, continuous flow of human memory. In the end, the revelation is not a single shocking discovery or a hidden document that overturns the chronicle of history. Instead, it is a shift in perception. It is a recognition that history is layered, that truth can be preserved in fragments, and that ancient civilizations leave echoes that travel far beyond their physical borders. These echoes do not announce themselves loudly. They linger quietly in architecture, symbols, traditions, stories, and the silent corridors of inherited memory. What survives is not the grandeur of empires, but the endurance of ideas.